Hello, I am Kaushik Srinivasan. I'm the co-founder at eMudhra.
Hello, I am Sudesh Kumar and I lead marketing at eMudhra. Welcome to eMudhra Podbytes. I am Sudesh and today I am with Kaushik Srinivasan, co-founder eMudhra. Good day Kaushik, how are you?
Hi Sudesh, doing well. How are you doing?
I've been doing well, thank you. So Kaushik, the first question, the elephant in the room in one line. Why is DPDP suddenly the conversation in every boardroom?
No, so all this obviously emanates a while back, right? Because I think Europe set a precedence with the GDPR regulation. The whole idea being that privacy is very critical or a fundamental right or a foundational right to every citizen. And therefore, given the number of digital assets we consume every day, a lot of our data is obviously landing on the other side where people are using that data for various purposes, send you messages, marketing, etc. So how do governments give citizens the right or the ability to figure out where their data is getting used? Is it getting used properly? Is it getting misused? What sort of the legal recourse to that? That was really the starting point. And which is why over time, progressively, governments kind of started putting in place data privacy measures in the form of acts, guidelines. And India obviously has been one of the earlier ones. So we've been working on it for a while. And the whole DPDP, which is a regulation, kind of became an act as of last year. And therefore now the enforcement follows, right? So that's why there's obviously a lot more attention to it because it's an act. It affects everybody that processes personal data, which is pretty much all of us. Because in some shape or form, when you onboard an employee, if you're an airline, you're allowing a person to book a ticket. If you are a bank that is issuing a loan, everybody is affected by this regulation. That's why it's like really the hot topic that everybody wants to know about. What does it mean? Right? Obviously, there are penalty provisions, so you don't comply, you've got to pay a massive fine. So that's why it's obviously the hot topic in the room, right?
Right, so I think that's a very foundational conversation that's going on today around data privacy and what's the remediation. So that brings me to the next question. Today we see largely most of the companies, or at least the public facing websites that we consume, as a consumer, all of them seem to be having a privacy consent policy on their website. Is that enough, or that bolt-on is enough, or something more is required?
That is almost like the tip of the iceberg, right?
Okay.
So what you see above is probably really the starting point. But where at least our focus is as eMudhra and where the industry's focus is the consent's really the starting point, right? So you know that you're disclosing the purpose of usage of the collection of data. Because as soon as a person lands on your website, they're doing a few things. You want to let them know at that point, what are you collecting their data for? And this includes everything, even before they sign up, like their IP address, you may be collecting, you may be asking for a location on the browser. There may be other things about their devices. So all of which means something to a platform in terms of being able to monetize that data. So that's really the starting point, right? But as you move beneath the surface is where it starts getting a lot more complex.
All right.
Because now once you collect consent to use the data, and the data could be names, it could be email addresses, it could be your machine details, it could be where you're browsing from, and these start progressively going either into your files or into your database, or let's say you're putting it into your CRM system where you're now starting to do an outbound telecalling campaign, or it goes into some kind of a marketing system. This is where the complexity begins.
Okay.
Because now you have, as sort of an owner of that data, as a fiduciary, have that responsibility to ensure that the data does not get misused.
Okay.
That's really the foundational starting point. Once you collect consent, you are disclosing the purpose of use. Once that data goes into your systems or into third-party systems, you've got to make sure that it does not get misused. Right, number one. Number two, this also means that you now have an obligation or you now have a need to essentially discover and classify the data that you've collected. Because all of us have been operating for the last several years, and some go back in time. They've been collecting personal data about individuals, about organizations, people acting within their organization. And again, PI data is a fairly complex topic, right?
True.
Because any individual data or data in conjunction with another data that can identify you or me or anybody as a person becomes personally identifiable information. So if you're capturing this, you now also got to discover, you've got to classify what's sensitive, what's personally identifiable, what is flowing through to third-party vendors, track the life cycle, all of this, and then finally protect it.
True.
So to repeat, consent's really the starting point. As an organization, you've got to look at it as a whole, figure out where your data is coming from, where it's moving, figure out what existing data sets you have, classify them, and if you have personal data that's identifiable, make sure you protect them.
Okay, that was interesting, and I think that's the entire conversation about beyond consent. So everything that happens after the point where you take in that consent, you have that data stored, and then that data could not be just about an OEM with their customers, but could be their third parties, whichever data fiduciary in that supply chain. So I think, yeah, that is very deep, and I think that's a very important point for the industry to know as a whole. So let's take the real world picture, Kaushik. Who needs the most? What does good look like in this scenario?
So there is really no good or bad, and there's really no who needs it the most, because everybody processes varying volumes or levels of personal information. So as I said, if I am onboarding an employee, I'm getting personal information. If I'm sort of collecting information to give a loan, I'm collecting personal information. If I'm allowing somebody to book a ticket, that's personal information. If I'm issuing an insurance policy, that's personal information. So almost everybody processes some level of personal data. The volume may vary depending on what type of business you are. If you're a business to business focused, or if you're business to consumer focused, obviously anything consumer focused processes a lot more volume of personal data. So it does affect everybody, and there is really no good or bad, because you've got to be compliant, right? And compliance means a bunch of things, because there are fairly strict and enforceable guidelines which have to translate into real world implementation. For instance, disclose the purpose of use. They have to have a cookie policy, you've got to have a privacy policy as a starting point, put the cookie banner, make sure you have fairly granular usage options that people can either check on or off, saying this kind of data I'm going to use it for marketing purposes, this kind of data I'm going to use for transactional purposes, this is for reporting and analytics, so that people are able to toggle on or off, number one. Number two, as that data flows downstream, you've got to track that life cycle. Which system is the data flowing in? Are you sending it to third-party vendors? All that has to get captured. So the whole data life cycle, and associated with that, the workflows. So now citizens have the right to also seek where their data is getting used. So this is something called a data subject access request. If somebody sends it in, now you have an obligation to provide information about that. If something needs to change, you and your downstream vendors have to ensure that those requests are complied with. 3, any data that goes into a system, be it a file, folder, with let's say a PAN number, or with let's say personal information, mobile number, has to be protected or encrypted. This is again challenging, because you could have dime a dozen systems, but that world starts with even figuring out what digital footprint are you maintaining of a person. Does it even need to be maintained? So there's a concept called data minimization. So keep only what is absolutely essential and do not capture what is not essential. And what is essential, make sure you protect it or encrypt it, right? So these are all the layers, right, that go beyond consent. Because consent is the starting point. I'm sure there are enough people who've done deep analysis of how do you track consents. But beyond that is where the actual technology implementation starts.
Absolutely. So Kaushik, for a company that hasn't started, what are the first few things that they need to consider, since you also mentioned there's a timeline? Now there is a hard deadline that everyone needs to follow in India with regards to DPDP. So how to start, where to start, what's your take on this?
Yeah, as I said, it's hard to build these platforms by yourself. There are a number of people that are developing platforms that pretty much comply to DPDP as it stands and as it evolves and as it's likely to evolve. eMudhra is one of them. Obviously, there are many consulting firms that give you advisory on how to implement, but it's best to adopt a platform that has all of these different capabilities. We've been working on private trust,
yes.
Right? So our private trust basically captures all of these different life cycle. But again, our key focus is going beyond consent, right? Is give the organization the ability as a platform to discover the digital assets that they have, that they've collected, that they maintain. Because there are one or more scenarios that can occur. There could be cases where you've, let's say, captured consent, but you essentially storing the data, you don't know where it is. How do you correlate the consent with the data? And also going forward, if you're capturing data, you also need to make sure that's associated with the consent, because you can't have data where there's not a consent available to track the life cycle of the data, right? So there are all of these different scenarios, number one. Number two, our world has always been the data protection world. We come from the world of keys and certificates. That's what we've been solving for the last 17, 18 years. This is a space that we understand deeply, is how do you protect personal data? How do you manage the keys that protect personal data? How do you encrypt? How do you operate on encrypted data? And most recently, we've been working even on data classification as a problem statement, because classification itself is getting complex. It's no more a rule saying just give me all 12-digit numbers that look like a national ID number, or give me like all 8-digit numbers that looks like a tax ID number. You need AI there. You need things like small language models that are highly trained, specific to classifying any kind of combination of data or anything that looks like personally identifiable information in PDFs, in files, in folders, in databases. And that's exactly the space that we solve. So while we do solve consent, going beyond this as a platform, we've really focused on the depth of protection of personal data while being able to classify it at scale with the aid of artificial intelligence and generative AI.
That's right, Kaushik. I have a question on a lighter note, Kaushik, here, and I would want to ask this PDF called DPDP. When does it actually become an engineering problem?
Everything.
Or does it?
Everything digital is obviously an engineering problem, because PDF lays down the rules, but at some point it becomes a technology problem statement, because and it's also dependent on the complexity of the client's environment. If you are a large bank and you've been doing business for 100 years, you can imagine the complexity, right? So that's
legacy
where
systems and
exactly, right? Legacy systems, personal data that's in so many disparate, and you can't all of a sudden stop systems, right? So you've got to work through that transition, which is where it becomes a fairly complex exercise. Multiple teams are involved, platform players are involved. You have to tailor the platform to the requirement of the customer, not probably the other way around.
Yes.
Which is why a pure play, one size fits all approach may never work in such cases. And you really need a mature sort of system integrator plus a platform provider plus somebody that understands the space to come together to solve such problems, right? So all of these are obviously engineering problems, because anything digital, the toy is only the beginning. It's a technology that has to then comply with the law.
Yes. And eMudhra is ready for that with private trust. And yes, we are there to solve the problem. Kaushik, thank you so much. This conversation has been really amazing. I think, for lack of better words, it's an eye-opener for the industry, for sorts. And I think we really look forward to what's there to come.
Thank you, Sudesh. I do want to leave our audience with a small note. The world is very rapidly changing. We are seeing intersection of 2-3 very interesting trends. One is obviously the need for privacy, but as a consequence, the whole importance attached to data security has gained a lot of prominence.
Yes.
In this, the world of AI and what it can do, plus the world of quantum computing and what it can do, there are many foundational changes coming. Right? So everybody has to plan this transition very carefully. It's no longer just protecting the data. Tomorrow the encryption breaks, what do you do?
Yeah.
Right. So all these themes have to be taught in conjunction, which is why the role of the CISO is extremely, extremely important. And the understanding that they can then bring to the table through a mature ecosystem of players is probably going to be vital in generally the country's transition to the next level of cybersecurity.
Even the DPOs, I guess.
Yeah, even the DPOs.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sudesh.
Thank you so much, Kaushik. This was interesting.